I've always been mystified by the fear of gossip in the letters of the New Testament. As I traveled in evangelical circles, the only sin that was talked about more than gossip was premarital sex. So it was right up there. I didn't think for myself too much back then. I mostly did what people told me to do, but this obsession with gossip always seemed really strange. I thought to myself, people are starving and dying around the world. There's war and greed and the oceans are warming, and you're telling us that what we really need to do as Christians is guard ourselves against gossip? But sure enough, in the letters of the New Testament, there's this emphasis on controlling our tongues. Don't speak angry words. Don't speak gossipy words. And we hear a similar theme in James today. 1:26. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Oof. In the last 10 to 15 years in the church, there's been an emphasis on the small group. The big mega churches are mega in part because they have hundreds of micro churches within them. They have small groups where people gather in homes and eat together and study the Bible and pray. And over time, their faith grows and their relationships grow. The early churches were more like small groups than mega churches, and more like small groups in many ways than our churches. They were intensely relational. And when you have deep relationships, small, close-knit community, gossip becomes a problem. Anyone who has lived their life in a small town might be able to tell you the same thing. Writer Wendell Berry speaks of gossip as a sign that community is happening. He redeems gossip in a way. In order for there to be gossip, people have to be participating in each other's lives to the point that they have access to information they don't really need. Now, in our time, when community is breaking down, when we're increasingly fragmented from one another, where people are searching for community, example would be Facebook, perhaps we need gossip to be more of a problem and not less. Now, that's a statement that I know will haunt me, but I'm saying it anyway. So maybe you've wondered about this gossip emphasis. Maybe you haven't. I just needed to deal with that and put it aside before I dealt with the rest of the passage. When James isn't worried about managing relationships in a tight-knit community, the writer is focused on encouraging Christians to follow the way of God rather than the way of the world. And this is going on throughout the letter. The way of God, way of the world distinction is simple. It's too simple, maybe, but it's helpful for teaching because it's very clear. James wants us to trust that what is most real is God's grace and generosity. Never mind that we're trained to see matter as most real, the wood we knock on, the ground we walk on. For James, what is most obvious and most trustworthy is this generosity of God. This is the way of God. Now, in contrast, the way of the world is the way of fear of scarcity. For us, it's usually not that we don't have what we need, it's that we fear we won't have what we need. And James will challenge us to let go of this fear, to stop living in response to it, and to start trusting the reality of God's grace and generosity. Verse 17, every generous act of giving with every perfect gift comes from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. God is the source of every generous gift, every generous impulse that we have, always has been, always will be. Verse 18, in fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth. We are to believe in this word of truth, that grace and gift are what make the world go round. And we are not just to hear this word, but to do it, to act on it. Verse 22, James says, be doers of the word, not merely hearers who deceive themselves. And then writes at the end of this passage, religion that is pure and undefiled is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Scholar Luke Johnson writes, if reality is defined by the endless bestowal of gifts, then it is not a closed system, but an open one. Not a world of limited resources, but of infinitely renewable resources. And if God defines reality, then humans are not in competition with one another for their very being, so that their desires must lead ultimately to murder, which is something James deals with later. Rather, humans can gift each other as God gifts them. In other words, if we trust God's grace and generosity, and that is the heart of reality, and we trust that we always have what we need, then with gratitude and without fear, we can give to those in need. As we trust God's generosity, we become God's generosity. It's been nearly a year since our stock market started dropping like a rock, and we started grabbing for the bottle of scotch before we opened up our retirement account statement. We might say to James, well, we might be able to believe that God's generosity is trustworthy when times are good, but not now. No. But James will say, this is a message for now. James's congregation appears to be poor, and yet James says that pure religion is sharing the little you have with people who need it even more than you. It's likely that James's congregation didn't always know where daily bread was going to come from, and yet they were encouraged to trust that God's grace and generosity were always present, that they were never going to go away, and that they would provide what was needed. Our conference minister, David Moyer, sends out what he calls news and notes every now and again. They're usually words of encouragement for pastors. It's Advent, hang in there. It's Holy Week, hang in there. He sent one in August. It's August, hang in there. And what he wrote caught my attention. I've been thinking about it this week, so I want to share it with you. It's a reflection on the loaves and fishes story from the Gospel of John. He writes, "Give us this day our daily bread. I pray it regularly." It's a rich phrase that recalls the people of Israel wandering in the wilderness and discovering the gift of grace in a surprising and mysterious supply of daily food, but also the gracious test of faith to see if they would trust the supplier. Trust me, they didn't. Sufficiency was insufficient, and so they gathered a double portion of the bread which the Lord has given you to eat, and it got to stinking up the place. So if you know the manna story, you know that God gave the people 1 day of manna at a time. And if they gathered a double portion, then it was going to rot. This is what God told them, but they still gathered a double portion and it still rotted on them. Now I sit in church on Sunday, and I hear about those who were equally miraculously and sufficiently fed from the loaves and fishes, but, like their forebears, are unable to curb their appetites for more and pursue Jesus, supposedly with questions, but Jesus isn't fooled. You seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Just so you know, your preaching doesn't fall on deaf ears. There's that encouragement for the pastors in the trenches again. I think about this text when I'm talking to an acquaintance at the health club. We are talking about retirement, his of the past 10 years, and mine somewhere in the next few. I say, I don't know when I'll retire because I lost 40% of my retirement account. He says, you're lucky, I lost 55%. And I think about daily bread. In reality, I haven't yet lost anything. I haven't lost $1 of my retirement because I haven't tried to collect anything. Oh, there are some pretty big numbers that disappeared off a printed page overnight last fall, but that's what they are, numbers. Unlike many, I haven't yet missed a meal or been denied health care, or been without shelter. What I lost were expectations of what my eventual retirement might be like. I lost the presumed entitlement to a particular image of life or a standard of living I had in mind. And that image had little to do with what is sufficient, and everything to do with gathering multiple days' worth of manna that we like to call unrealized assets. Even at the reduced rate of 60%, of what I thought I might have, sufficiency is not in question. Which isn't to say I don't turn to the Dow each day and see what has fallen from the manna market. I just took a peek, and the Dow is up 146 points right now at 94.02, a 9-month high. Of course, the rise still begs the question of how much you can accumulate and have it not corrupt what both Exodus and the Gospel of John, and we'll add James, seem to see as the core of faith, namely, trust.